Let's get started, because there's a lot to go over. So, this is a slightly different kind of talk. Yeah, we're going to go over a lot of methodological questions here, right? We're not going to talk about a lot of the technical parts. I mean, the Equifax breach has probably been analyzed to complete death, technically, right? What we're going to do is we're going to talk about a different level of analysis, right? Not something which is supposed to supersede technical analysis, but something which can very much exist alongside of it. And we're going to get into all kinds of weird topics, like the history of land enclosure, and the giving of last names, and the building of structures of individuation, and all these kinds of things to help us analyze what the actual implications of something like a massive PII breach, like Equifax, actually means. So, before we get into all that, a little bit about myself. I used to actually be a college philosophy professor, taught at Binghamton University for a little bit, adjuncted at a bunch of colleges. Gave that up and got into Infosec and started off doing threat intelligence, and now I work as a pen tester. I like a lot of really nerdy stuff, right? Always have, always will. Used to love hacking around on Nintendo games and stuff, and now it's like radios and satellites and all that kind of stuff. I'm really passionate about these kinds of things. Like, information security isn't just cool, right? And I would argue with my friends all the time, like, this is the coolest part of tech you could possibly be into because it's the most creative. It's really fun. But it also has these global implications, right? Anyone that caught the talk earlier about technology and human rights can even get a small glimpse into the implications of the things that we do, right? The talk that I gave last year with my friend James was all about that as well, right? The things that we can actually do with an hour or two of time out of our week to change the actual way that the world functions is absolutely spectacular given the skills that we have. Right now, I'm also trying to learn exploit writing. I really like that kind of way deep down in the weeds, kind of reversing binaries and like that kind of stuff. And I'm trying to learn. So if anyone knows a bunch of stuff, hit me up. Also, as I'm required to say, the views expressed here are my own and not those of the people that sign my paychecks. So what are we going to be talking about? We're talking about philosophy, right? Sure, everybody that went to college had to take a philosophy class. Sure, it was probably like real boring. And people probably talked a lot about like utilitarianism and stuff. But philosophy is like much broader than that, right? It's not just a field of study. It's actually the analysis of the ways that we think, right? The ways that we break ideas down, the ways that we attach ideas together, our assumptions, our preconceptions, and the ways that those lead to certain kinds of conclusions, and ultimately, when we get into the realm of ethics, action. We're also going to be talking about methodology, right? So methodology is the process and structures that we use to construct philosophical outlooks on things. It's the ways, the assumptions that we bring to the table when we're assembling concepts together, right? And these could be methodological assumptions like, say, the scientific method. These could also be methodological assumptions that come along with sort of any ideological structure, right? And we all have these. We're going to be talking about theories of the modern nation state. Specifically, the nation state as we understand it right now. Right? This sort of structure of being an individual, like an ethical, moral, political individual within a grander meta-structure. Right? This is a very recent idea. It's one that's only about 400 years old, and we're going to be talking about the implications of that. We're also going to be talking about finance. Right? A lot of the history of Equifax really comes down to the history of the growth of credit and debt markets, and the ways that we can understand those in the information age, starting in the 1970s. We're going to go very deeply into detail on this. We're also going to talk about like technology and computers and stuff. But not Kraftwerk, unfortunately. This is the only Kraftwerk reference, which makes me sad. So, why would I subject everybody to this, right? Like, we're not in college anymore. We all did intro philosophy. Like, why are we doing this? Infosec is actually made up of a lot of really interesting people, most of which don't come from tech backgrounds, right? Like on my team, I think there's 2 people that come from tech backgrounds. The rest of us come from, anthropology backgrounds, sociology backgrounds. They were musicians. They were all kinds of stuff, right? Infosec tends to gather really interesting people that come into it for all kinds of different reasons, right? And because of that, we have the possibility of engaging in really interesting forms of analysis. However, traditionally, and a lot of this has to do with the kind of business use case of what we're doing, we tend to analyze things on a more technical level, on a purely technical level. And that shapes our assumptions and our methodologies as we go forward to analyze the implications of some of these things, and therefore kind of the mitigations and the ways that we can deal with some of this stuff. And a great example of this is the Equifax breach. And the reason I chose this is that the Equifax breach is incredibly simple technically, right? They didn't patch a server that was running struts. They got popped. People left. They came back. They raided a bunch of data, they left, and all of our stuff is potentially out there now, right? It's technically very simple, right? The mitigation is patch your stuff, right? That's real easy. But the social implications of the Equifax breach, just like the breach of OPM and other things like that, are catastrophic potentially. And this is what's important for us to understand. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about interdisciplinary approaches, right? So approaches that leave the technical realm and start to bring in other forms of analysis, right? And I'm going to talk about what interdisciplinarity is, since it's an often misunderstood term. So what is interdisciplinarity? So interdisciplinarity is a response to the separation of disciplines within academia. So in the modern era, all of a sudden, universities started having things like math departments, which are separate from science departments, which are separate from philosophy, which are separate from theology and logic and theosophy and so on, so on, so on. Like all these different kinds of departments. Many schools have like really unique, interesting departments like media studies and stuff like this. But the disciplinary approach to education assumes a sort of separation between these things, right? Every single discipline comes with a series of philosophical assumptions. So we take something like sociology, okay? I always pick on sociology, but we take something like sociology. Sociology is based on the assumption that there is an object called society that is singular that we can study and come to conclusions about. And that forms the entire field, right? We have an idea of psychology. Namely, the initial presumptions of the field of psychology were that there is an analyst that can sit there and fully understand the mental processes of an outside person and write academic papers about that, right? Now, most of these disciplines don't hold to those assumptions anymore. We've come farther than that. But their basis and the way that they're separated and the way that we're trained as students is based on this disciplinary approach. So interdisciplinarity is different than multidisciplinarity. So multidisciplinarity is an approach where you go, okay, I'm going to do a sociological economic analysis of blah, 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 right? What you're doing is you're assuming still the veracity of the assumptions behind certain disciplines, just jamming them together, right? What we're talking about is something very different. Interdisciplinarity is an approach which completely rejects the separation of disciplines and pulls in data and methods as we need them to develop the most efficient and effective analysis of something, right? So the goal here is not necessarily to solve problems, right? Problems like what do we do about PII breaches are incredibly complicated. The goal here is to contribute to problem identification, right? What is the problem that we're trying to solve as the way that it's constantly put in startup culture, right? Problem analysis. So how are we analyzing that problem that we identify? And contextualization, right? So how do we understand this problem in relation to things that might exist traditionally outside of it, right? So in this case, we're really talking about structures of ourselves in a world, in an economic system in relation to something called the internet, right? And so what we have to do, and what we're going to do during this talk, is start to break down what all of that means and how we even got to this place. So there's a tendency in Infosec to discuss technology in sort of the following ways, right? This is part of the beginning of the problem identification. We will talk about things as purely technical problems, right? This is traditionally the analysis of the Equifax breach, right? There was a server hanging out there, it's running some software. Software is vulnerable, so we'll launch an exploit, blah, 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 right? And what that does is it sort of takes the machine, it takes the technology, and it removes it from the context of its development, and its use, and its implication. Sometimes we'll take on a technical problem that's connected to, say, a single event, right? So we'll talk about a PII breach. We'll talk about a campaign to, like, say, poison the well on Facebook. We'll talk about something like this, right? But we usually talk about it in relation to a single event and isolate that event from its implications and its broader sort of possibilities, right? Sometimes we'll look at it through the lens of the history of a technology or technologies, but take that technology in isolation. So say the phone system. Right? How many people here have a long history of reading 2600 magazine? Right? I do. Right? 2600 is like super interesting, but one of the things that happens in that world is they focus on the phone system. Right? Especially older versions of 2600, it's like, this is a phone system, this is a computer in the phone system, and it's like mad cool. Like, check out this computer. And like, maybe they'll talk about the history of the phone system and how we got there, but it never like extends outside of that one technical system, right? So what we often miss here are the dynamics of how these technologies came to be, right? So for example, one of the kind of side forms of research I'm doing is looking at the connections between the modern internet and the telegraph system, and how the telegraph system developed, and how that led to certain structures in telecommunications, which then led to a certain architecture of the internet, right? But we miss these sort of dynamics of development, historical implications, and we specifically engage in analysis, which is based on the assumption that we can separate technology from the conditions of its creation and implications. What I'm trying to encourage us to do is not do that. And we're going to talk about why. So Equifax, right? Let's talk about Equifax for a minute. Equifax does a lot of things. Equifax is not just a credit reporting agency. Equifax is a data broker, right? It started in 1899, right, as a retail credit company. And what it was doing was it was selling information to companies about their customers over the telegraph system, right? So a company would like shoot them a telegraph and go, hey, do you know John Smith in New York? And they'd like look through their records and go, oh yeah, we know John Smith in New York, hit off a record back to them over the telegraph system. And that's how credit checks used to work. Now, there were a lot of problems with this, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But just for the time being, in 1970, they changed their name to Equifax. And the reason they changed their name to Equifax was something called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act generated a lot of negative publicity for these credit checking companies. Because all of a sudden, people were like, wait, but I'm not John Smith who robbed a bank in New York, yet I couldn't get my home loan because you said I was John Smith who robbed a bank in New York, and there's no accountability for this. And so the credit agencies that exist now, a lot of them start coming into being around 1970 because of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. In the case of Equifax, they literally just changed their name in order to get away from negative publicity, and that's how they ended up getting called Equifax. So, going back over what we already know, the initial breach happened in March 2017. Again, the main breach where all the data was stolen happened between May and July of 2017. At the time that I wrote this, the number is at 143 million credit records. That number is probably higher, but we really don't know. Let's just say it's most adults in the United States had some sort of information stolen during this data breach. So two questions arise here, which I think are probably the two questions we usually ask with data breaches is, what happened, right, which we're going to answer in a very different way here, and what can we do about it, which we're also going to answer in a very different way here than traditionally. So to understand both of these things in relation to something as complex as Equifax, we have to think about how we found ourselves here at this point in history, right? How is it that we have something called a social security number, which individuates us as human beings, as people, which is attached to all this other data about our history, which ended up on something called the internet, so it was accessible, right? How did we find ourselves at this point? Because until we can answer that question, we can't really figure out what to do about something like massive PII breaches. So to get there, we have to go all the way back to the 17th century. It's kind of a weird place to go. If anyone's wondering, these are French cadastral maps. So the French government in the 17th century went around and tried to map out land ownership in all these small towns across France. They did this in England too. They did this throughout Europe later, but essentially what happened is the French government found out that nobody had a concept of ownership, right? There wasn't this notion that I'm an individual who owns this land separate from the use of my community. And that's this map over here. So they end up mapping out land usage. But you can't collect taxes based on that. And really what they were doing was trying to collect taxes. So they had to attach land to individuals. They ended up coming up with systems like that, right? Everything's nice and gridded off. Everybody had land deeds all of a sudden. And most importantly, they gave everybody last names, right? So most people at this point in history in Europe may have had something that they were referred to as, but there wasn't like a name on paper with a first and last name that individuated them from other people necessarily, right? So they went around essentially indexing whole populations during this process of land enclosure and the construction of private property in the modern era. So, the reason that this was done, again, was partially for taxation. Partially, it was because of geopolitical shifts and philosophical shifts in politics that happened at the end of the fall of monarchies, right? So this process started with the beginning of the French Revolution. It ended with the end of what we now call the French Revolution, right? The end of the French Revolution, where the monarchy was overthrown, and all of a sudden you had this sort of structure of voting in parliaments and things like this. People became individuals all of a sudden, right? And this is an important philosophical shift. So before this, we were sort of people that existed within metastructures, right? In Europe, that structure was largely based on Catholicism, right? We were sort of people that existed within the kingdom of God. Everything was like morally determined, and we were just kind of here, right? Part of the anti-monarchist revolutions were about being individual moral and ethical agents, right? And so that process bureaucratically is tended to break down to this idea of you being identified as an individual person separate from your community and separate from the history that landed you there, right? And we still very much have these kind of assumptions that underlie a lot of what we do. So, systems for organizing people ran into a very basic problem, which I'm sure is incredibly predictable, which is people have the same name. There was actually a joke social organization in New York. I forgot the name. It was something like John Smith. It was something like that. There were like 700 people in Manhattan with the same name. and they kept getting their credit check records like mistaken for each other, and some of them were like relatively bad dudes. And so like other guys weren't getting like cars and houses and stuff because the credit check agencies would be like, oh yeah, John Smith here, and send the record. And everyone would be like, but you robbed a bank, you can't buy a house. It'd be like, what do you mean? I'm an accountant. Like, and so there was actually the support group that built up in New York City for guys with all the same name, and they met all the way through the 1980s, right? Because up until the advent of the Social Security number, there was essentially no way to individuate two people with the same name, right? Especially if they lived in the same city or had lived in a string of the same cities. There was no way to do this, and so mistakes were really common. So in 1936, millions of people all of a sudden started getting identified by these 9-digit numbers. And the way that that worked is you would go into the post office, right? So your employer would file records of all their employees in 1936. And the Labor Department was starting to give them identification numbers, individuated identification numbers. If you weren't working, you would go into the post office where you filed your taxes, and they would give you an ID number. And that's how we got Social Security numbers, this incredibly manual system. Now, one of the weird parts of the history of the Social Security system is that the US government was trying to figure out how to do this in 1936. And there were two countries in the world in the mid-30s that were already indexing all of their populations by numbers. And I'm sure, does anyone have any guesses as to who those were? Germany and Italy, right. Fascist governments were indexing their populations in order to figure out who to detain, right. So the US government sent representatives to Italy first, who said, yeah, you can't do this, it's too complicated. They sent representatives to Germany, and they said, well, I mean, we haven't figured it out, but there's this company called IBM that's making these punch card systems that we're using. You guys should totally go like those punch card systems. So they did. And they bought a bunch of IBM 100 punch card systems, hundreds of them. They were custom made for the Social Security Administration. There were whole floors of the Social Security building full of these things, with people running punch cards on individual people. And this was really the first time in American history, in the mid-30s, that people were reliably individuated, right? Before this, individuation was kind of an approximate process, right? But this was really the time where we became economic individuals, for better or worse, was when we were handed these specified Social Security numbers. Kind of side fact, they used these IBM 100 punch card systems all the way through the mid-50s until they kind of upgraded to like actual computers. But they were using these punch card systems for like 25 years, and they never broke because they were like infinitely reliable. So, for a very long time, most people didn't get credit checks that often, right? If you came back from the war, like if you were a veteran from the war, you would go talk to the VA would talk to FHA, right, Federal Housing Authority. Federal Housing Authority would tap you into a bank, the bank would give you a subsidized housing loan, and there wasn't really much of a credit check involved. It was sort of like a veteran's benefit for fighting in the war, right? People were going and buying cars, they were getting credit from the car dealership, but there wasn't really like a credit check that happened very often behind that, unless you were buying a very expensive car, right? People got credit cards at, department stores. People had different kinds of these sort of essentially tabs that they would build up. If you lived in a small town, it was pretty common that you would have a tab with your corner store or something like that, right? And there were all these informal systems of credit that really existed until the mid-1970s. And something happened in the 1970s which fundamentally changed all of that. And that was the 1970s oil crisis. So 1973, OPEC decided that they were going to jack up the price of oil. And it caused a massive crisis in the United States. The resolution to that process was the US government going to Saudi Arabia and essentially threatening to bomb the country if they didn't start both producing more oil and taking their oil revenues and putting it in American banks. And so they did. Billions and billions and billions of dollars of cash flowed into American banks, right around the same time that banking deregulation was happening. And so when that happened, that created most of what we now know as the credit card market, right? Companies existed before that where you could get a credit card, but all of a sudden credit expanded really dramatically. Another thing was going on at this period of time, which is that automation and offshoring, but mostly automation, was taking away traditional manufacturing jobs. And so unemployment was going up, wages were dropping, and yet we were spending more and more and more money than we ever had before somehow. And this persisted all the way until 2008, when the whole thing came crashing to the ground. But the reason that that was possible was all of a sudden people could get easy credit. And so in that process, these credit reporting agencies became profoundly important. There was another thing that changed around this period of time. Namely, credit checks started happening over something that would become called the internet, right? So before the 1990s, before the spec for the World Wide Web, A lot of this was happening over subnetworks like TimeNet and things like this, where companies like TRW, actually, were a major credit checking agency at the time, would transfer credit records to banks over TimeNet, and banks would make credit decisions, right? And this was all happening very manually, oftentimes through like entirely unsecure servers, right? I just got through reading the history of the Masters of Deception, like the hacking crew from the 90s, and they talk about how they got access to TimeNet, and there was essentially nothing standing in their way from just getting anyone's credit report that they wanted. They could just log into any server. There weren't really creds, and all they had to do was just like search around, and they could get anyone's credit report. And they were pulling credit reports on people pretty consistently, right? So there was like no security for this, but because credit checks had to happen so much more frequently, they started happening electronically because it was the only way to keep up with the pace. You couldn't do that over the phone. You couldn't have humans really on the phone reading off a credit report. You had to send this stuff electronically. But, and one of the talks I'll give in the future is about why there was no internet security. So one of the things that happened when they were developing the SAGE system in the 1950s. So the SAGE, how many people know what SAGE is? Or was? It doesn't exist anymore. So SAGE was the system that was built by the US military to network all the missile detection radar systems that were positioned around North America together and send that data to Air Force Central Command, right? To be able to decide whether they were going to dispatch planes or anti-ballistic missile defense systems to intercept missiles. To do that, they had to create modems, right? So these modems are created by Bell Labs to allow for the transfer of data. That process was all funded by, at the time, ARPA, before it was DARPA. And DARPA had very tight grant deadlines. And so the people that are developing this are like, yeah, I mean, we're going to do this, but like, what happens if someone gets access to this network? Right? And there's this guy named Willis Ware. He worked at the RAND Corporation at the time. He wrote this big, long white paper about why it was really important to probably bake security into the specs for what would become the internet. And the people that were running that project for ARPA went, yeah, but our grant deadline's in like 2 weeks. So we just can't do that. And so all the networks that were built after that were built on specs with no security, right? And we're still dealing with this problem. Most of us in this room have a job because of that decision, literally, right? And yeah, right, boom. So anyways, with the advent of the World Wide Web and this kind of increased penetration of internet access into everyday life, now all of a sudden we have a big problem. So these companies aren't just taking our financial data, but they're aggregating everything they can get. Purchasing habits, right? What kinds of things we own, where we live, where we've lived, what our phone numbers are, like all the data they can get. So when the World Wide Web becomes a thing, all of a sudden, a number of things start happening. The first is, those companies get a lot more data about us all of a sudden, right? And a company like Equifax has these incredibly detailed reports on our lives because they're buying marketing data from the same companies that are getting it from Google, right? And so they have these incredibly detailed profiles of who we are as people. And this process starts building up in the mid-1990s. The other thing that happens is now all of a sudden all these records are just hanging out on the internet, where now there's a lot of people and no security, right? So not only are there a lot of people and no security, there's no way to figure out when you've been breached. I mean, keep in mind, there weren't really like robust firewalls at this period of time. There weren't SIMs, there wasn't log tracking, there was none of the stuff that we all use now, right? There's a really funny story about the first time someone developed a firewall, again, for the Air Force, right? They were running it at some base in Kansas or something. They started seeing tons of attack traffic. And they're like, whoa, this is pretty crazy. What they did was they started going back through the logs. They noticed these attackers were in the network for like years, a couple of years. This led to an international incident because they ended up backtracking them to like a relay through a library in Fort Collins, Colorado, and then back to Russia. So they were all like KGB, right? But the funny side story of that is they go to do a demonstration for some admirals in DC, and they flip the screen on and they show them the logs, and the admiral's like, "What are you doing? You turn this thing on, now all of a sudden we're getting attacked everywhere," right? Because no one had seen anything like that. There was nothing to do that. So now all of our data is hanging out on the internet, right? There's no security, there's no tracking, there's really no real logging, right? And we have a big problem. So, when we think of Equifax, we can't just think of a breach that happened because some poor guy who was by himself, responsible for patching every single server in the entire company, didn't patch a server fast enough and they got nailed, right? Really what we're talking about is a confluence of a number of historical dynamics that all come together at the same point that led to all of our data getting stolen. right? So we're talking about a confluence of remotely accessible credit checking systems, which correlate with ideas of social security numbers and credit histories, structures of individuation in the modern nation state, right? Large data gathering operations and the monetization of data, which is really where a lot of these companies make their money. Like Equifax doesn't primarily make its money by selling credit reports. It primarily makes its money by selling our data to marketers, just like Google or Facebook, right? And so what happens is this body of data gets built up and tied to unique identifiers, right? So to be economic agents within the current form of social organization, we're required to be individuals, economically individual. And now all of this data is being aggregated to that individual identifier, right? Which are much more robust than financial records. And if that data were to be breached, like we're worried about our individual credit histories and our individual data getting into the hands of somebody else. But with this volume of data, you could do anything from figure out ways to map general economic trends, right? Probably better than, the State Department could, all the way down to social engineering an individual person or stealing an individual person's identity, right? And everything literally in between. So this is much bigger than just Equifax, right? This problem that we're talking about here is much bigger than just Equifax. Equifax is simple, right? The problem of individuation and structures of individuation is much more complicated, right? So we've tended to focus on the mundane yet incredibly important aspects of patching policy, right? Incident response and things like this, right? Some people have even pushed it into the realm of starting to talk about social security numbers themselves, right? Really funny side story. I forgot who it was, but some Infosec person was like, yeah, we could just use cryptographic IDs like Estonia. It was like 2 weeks after that, Estonia's database got breached. And all the cryptographic IDs for all the people got stolen. And the point that the Estonian government was making is, yeah, I mean, they're like long and randomized, but just because they're longer and more randomized than a 9-digit number doesn't mean they didn't just get stolen. And can't still be correlated down to an individual because we have to do that, right? That's the entire point of doing this, right? So this mundane analysis is a clearly legitimate layer of analysis. And I would say probably for most of us in our daily work, especially those of us who work blue team, right? It's super important, right? Patching policy is super important. Incident response is super important. All these things are really important. And those are really important to protect the people that you work for from having to deal with something very similar. But what those approaches don't do is solve the general problem or even start a conversation about how we can solve the general problem, right? So we do engage in these other forms of analysis pretty frequently, right? There was a talk upstairs today about technology and human rights, which was really amazing, right? We talk about cryptography in this way, right? Cryptography, when you really boil it down, is a question of math. But that math has massive implications on our lives, right? Whether that's protecting our banking transactions or preventing government overreach. Cryptography is really important for us, much more important than just the technicalities of mathematics, right? We talk about net neutrality in this way, right? The question of net neutrality isn't just a question of ISPs doing deep packet inspection, throttling our connections, and things like this, but there are massive social implications to the erosion of net neutrality, right? And the discussion has largely focused on these social implications. What I'm suggesting here is that we can apply the same form of analysis to the way that we do our everyday jobs, right? The ways that we analyze our own data protection, the ways that we think about what we're actually doing, right? Any of us that work in the financial industry, the insurance industry, or something like that, our roles are more important than just making sure our servers don't get hacked, right? I mean, these are like our parents' bank accounts and stuff. And there's actually something relatively important on the level of social implication about that. So when we're talking about Equifax and other breaches with large amounts of PII, we're not merely discussing data breaches, right? What we are discussing is this convergence of commerce, finance, and individuation, and the ways that we become economic and political subjects, right? How are we defined as people within a social system? And in what ways is that itself being compromised by the fact that those identifiers are being taken, right? Because now, probably everybody in this room, you can't tell if the person trying to buy a house is you or somebody else, because it could very well be somebody else, right? And there's literally no way to guarantee the integrity of that data at this point, because it's been stolen any number of times. Anyone that's ever gone through a government background check before the OPM breach, this is now your second time around this block, at least, right? So this sort of unease about what it means for us to be individuated subjects and how data breaches come to converge with that already is expressed in a really interesting way and was expressed around the OPM breach. I don't remember if people remember the discussion around the OPM breach, but people were saying things like, well, you can't change your fingerprints, which you can, but it's really painful. Or you can't change your pattern in your iris, right? Like biometric data, you can't really change except they're incredibly painful processes. And how people were really creeped out by that, right? Because now all of a sudden somebody else could say like, take some gelatin and make your fingerprint. And some InfoSec person in Germany actually did that. They like took a printout of a fingerprint and from the printout made a gelatin version of a fingerprint, pasted it onto their finger and broke into their friend's iPhone, right? Like you can do that kind of, I mean, that's like, that was at CCC. It was like crazy research. But you can totally do stuff like that, right? So when someone steals your like biometric data, we get really uneasy about that for like really good reasons. Partially because people are even collecting this stuff to begin with. Partially because now it's really hard to just be you, even in a physical sense. But the same thing occurs when all of our data is being stolen electronically as well, right? That these are the things that make us subjects right now. So the problem, right? It's a very different problem set than just the problems that most of us address every day. I mean, I work as a pen tester, right? My biggest problem is like, can I make this thing be really cool, right? And like, how am I going to communicate this to a development team that I did this thing, right? People working on blue team, like, the problems are, oh yeah, let's wait for everyone to get inside. Oh yeah, I've got one too. Is everybody cool? Yeah? Okay, awesome. So what we're talking about here is a very different problem set than a lot of us deal with every day, right? And a lot of us deal with really complicated problems in really large institutions, but this is a very different problem set. We have relatively good ideas about how to patch our servers. We have relatively good ways of doing incident response, and like, they're not perfect. But really, what we're talking about here is a problem that extends beyond how to keep data safe. And anyone that's ever worked as a pen tester knows that like, even if devs are like super, super, super careful and like really on point and really care about security, like there's usually always at least some way into something, right? And data's never actually really safe because attacks change, right? And like we get better at this as people who do like offensive security stuff, right? We get better at this all the time. Really what we're starting to talk about here is not necessarily a technical problem. We're starting to talk about the social problem of what it means to collect this kind of data to begin with. What it means to attach it to the idea of a structure of individuation, which sort of separates us from social implication, and what it means to build our ideas of our own identities off that information, right? Because now it's not just a question of all of our data being stolen technically. Now it's an idea of our very identities being taken, right? Not in the sense of like our social security numbers or our financial history, but in the sense of who we are as individuals, right? Who we are as people, or whether we even conceive of ourselves as that at this point, right? And how to think through structures in which we don't conceive of ourselves as that. And that's a very different sort of much more social problem. So, what I want to suggest to everybody is that we have to start looking outside of just the screen, right? Anybody that works at home, that's like really hard. Like how many people here work at home? Like I work at home, right? You totally get screen locked, right? You just like hone in on the screen, like you don't really see anything outside of that, like forget what time of the day it is and don't see daylight for multiple days on end. That totally happens, right? So it's difficult for us sometimes to think about what happens outside of that, right? And really everything that we're doing at the end of the day exists outside of the screen, right? We're existing in the screen, we're doing things technologically, but technology doesn't actually mean anything without the context that exists outside of itself, right? So just as with questions of biometrics, cryptography, surveillance, net neutrality, where many of us actually have interesting, complex ways of understanding the world, right, which we talk about incessantly on Infosec Twitter, if anyone's on Infosec Twitter. What I'm suggesting here is that we can approach data and data breaches and our analysis of that in a very similar way. Now, we do that when we're talking about something like Facebook, right? We talk about what data Facebook is collecting because it actually had an impact on us, because at least for 50 million people, that data was stolen, right? Or gotten through an API, or whatever. However we want to classify what Cambridge Analytica did, right? What I'm suggesting is that we can apply the same logic to how we analyze data breaches in our everyday life, the things that we're dealing with on a daily basis, right? So interdisciplinary approaches can lend us this kind of space, right? It can pull us out of the screen, and it can allow us to start to contextualize the things that we're looking at. I would say like traditional non-professional hacker culture is very good at that. And the world that we have at work isn't often very good at that, right? It's about solving problems, clearing tickets, patching servers, things like this, right? But in that, we're missing something very important. That we're missing the opportunity to ask questions like, should we have this data to begin with, right? Is this something that we should be doing? What does it mean for us to do the kind of work that we're doing at this point in time, right? And that may allow us to construct more robust, meaningful analyses of these kind of problems that are very much attached to our everyday life, right? So, yeah, we're just going to end there. Does anybody have any questions before we all start getting rained on? Okay, cool. Thanks, everybody.